forms part and parcel of our work. And every day we are working hard to protect victims' rights in such cross-border criminal investigations and prosecutions. With this aspiration in mind, we are pleased to have welcomed the next of kin at our premises this morning, and now also you, representatives of the media. Thank you very much.
My name is Brechtje van der Moosdijk. I'm a spokesperson for the Netherlands Public Prosecution Service. Before we start, I'd like to introduce you to the representatives of the Joint Investigation Team. From the Netherlands, there's Deputy Chief Prosecutor Digna van Boetselaar and Mr. Andy Kraag, Head of the National Crime Division of the Police. Then Australia is represented by Assistant Commissioner David McLean of the Australian Police AFP. And then we have, on behalf of the Malaysian Prosecutor's Office, the head of the International Criminal Matters Unit, Mrs. Asha Ho Su Lian. Then from Belgium, we have Erik van der Sept of the Belgium Federal Prosecution's Office. And finally, from Ukrainian Public Prosecution Service, we have Prosecutor Alexander Banik. The presentation will last approximately 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and is followed by a short Q&A answer session. Afterwards, the representatives all here on stage are available for one-on-one interviews. We will do that here or outside. But I will now give the floor to Deputy Chief Prosecutor, Mrs. Digna van Boetselaar.
Good afternoon. We are meeting here today to update you, possibly for the last time, about the criminal investigation into the downing of flight MH17. This summer, it will be 9 years since 298 passengers lost their lives. As in previous years, we stand here together as members of the Joint Investigation Team, and we would like to thank Eurojust as the JIT's dedicated partner for facilitating this event. In 2016 and 2018, we told you about how the MH17 disaster came about. And in 2019, we explained that 3 Russians and a Ukrainian were suspected of being responsible for the downing of the aircraft. In July 2014, these men were military leaders of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, the DPR. On 9 March 2020, the criminal trial of these 4 defendants began in the Netherlands. And on 17 November 2022, the Hague District Court found 3 of them, Igor Gergin, Sergei Dubinsky, and Leonid Kharchenko, guilty of downing flight MH17, resulting in the deaths of 298 persons on board and the murders of those persons. The court sentenced the 3 men to life in prison. The 4th defendant, Oleg Pulatov, was acquitted. No appeal was lodged against these judgments, and the verdicts are irrevocable. In addition to considering the culpability of members of the DPR, the JIT conducted a wide-ranging investigation into the crew of the booktailer and the parties responsible for providing the weapon. To this end, the investigation team issued various witness appeals, and in 2021 it launched a media and letter campaign aimed at residents of Kursk and members of the 53rd Brigade. Various witnesses were interviewed, including members of the 53rd Brigade. In addition, the team reviewed a large number of intercepted phone conversations and other telecom data. It also investigated satellite images, gathered information about military radar systems, conducted covert investigative activities with the authorization of the examining magistrate, and examined both public and classified sources in depth. The JIT also received information from the European Space Agency and the Netherlands Defence Intelligence and Security Service. The investigation has now reached its limit. All leads have been exhausted. The investigation is therefore being suspended. At the present time, the findings are insufficient for the prosecution of new suspects. We will make the findings of the investigation public. That is the purpose of the presentation for the next of kin, this press conference, and a report that will be published today. In this way, we are complying with our national and international obligations to keep both the next of kin and the public at large informed. This information may also be relevant to the ongoing state responsibility proceedings. We will now present a summary of the report. We will be sharing the main findings of the investigation into the crew, their superiors, and the parties responsible for providing and deploying the book-tailor. For reasons of security and privacy, we are not able to release all the information uncovered in the investigation. This decision is also motivated by the possibility of further investigation and future prosecutions. We will not be mentioning any individuals by name except for public figures or in cases where the relevant names have already been made public. All of them should be considered innocent until a court finds that the reverse has been proven.
Thank you, Digna. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll start with the further investigation into the origin of the book TVBS that was used to shoot down MH17 and the crew members and their superiors. We'll then discuss those responsible for supplying the weapon system, and finally we will turn our attention to the parties involved in the deployment of the book TVBS. This presentation is based on the facts established by the court in its judgment of 17 November. Specifically, the court held that, as of May 2014, the Russian authorities exerted far-reaching control over the conflict being waged by the DPR. The book TVBS used to shoot down MH17 came from the Russian Federation, complete with a crew. Everyone who made a contribution to the deployment of the book TVBS bears responsibility for the downing of MH17. And while the exact actions of the crew during the launch of the book missile are unknown, nor is it known who gave the order to fire. To this day, the Russian authorities continue to deny any involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine, and they have presented falsified evidence on multiple occasions. The court also concluded that the images of the book TVBS captured in Ukraine on 17 and 18 July 2014 are authentic. As a result, they could be used for identification purposes. As the JIT has explained, this book TVBS has 15 specific features. A book TVBS with the same features was found to be part of a Russian military convoy originating in Kursk, which followed a southerly route along the Russian-Ukrainian border from 23 to 25 June 2014. We call it Book TVBS 3X2. We call it that because of the markings on its left side. The JIT was able to establish that this weapon system was from the Russian 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade in Kursk. In order to determine why flight MH17 was shot down, an investigation was conducted into the identity of the crew and their superiors. After all, they should be in a position to answer that question. A complicating factor was the absence of any telecommunications involving the crew. The telephone number which the court attributed to a crew member was active in Ukraine on 17 July. This number was not tapped, nor was it in contact with numbers that were tapped. This is why we first looked at the composition and organisation of the 53rd Brigade, which consists of approximately 700 people, conscripts, contract soldiers and officers. In 2014, the 53rd Brigade consisted of a staff and communications company, a technical support company, and 3 operational battalions. Each battalion has a full book system consisting of 11 book vehicles, a command vehicle, a radar vehicle, 3 launch vehicles without radar, the TEL, and 6 launch vehicles with radar, the TILA. A battalion is led by a commander and his deputy, and each has its own staff. Each battalion is divided into 3 companies, and a company consists of 2 TILAs and 1 TEL. As the court established, MH17 was shot down by a book TILA. Generally, the crew of this weapon system consists of 4 personnel: a commander, a first and second operator, and a driver. The commander is in charge of the vehicle and communicates with the battalion or brigade command. He is the only person on board who is authorised to launch a missile. In 2014, Colonel Sergei Muchkayev was in charge of the 53rd Brigade. According to Russian military law, as commander, he was responsible for carrying out operational missions and keeping track of his unit's positions. At that time, Muchkayev was under the command of the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces and the Russian Minister for Defence, Sergei Shoigu. Both are subordinate to the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. That concludes the matter of formal authority, however, which is not necessarily the same thing as de facto control over the deployment of the book TILA. We'll return to this point later. We will begin by focusing on various deployments of the 53rd Brigade in the summer of 2014. With the help of transport orders found in electronic mailboxes of several individuals, including officers of the 53rd Brigade, we were able to gain insight into the movement of equipment and personnel from the brigade's base to the border region with Ukraine at 3 points in time: 23 June, 15 July, and 19 July 2014. In late September 2014, equipment and personnel were transported back to Kursk. Book TILA 3X2 was part of the first convoy, which left on 23 June. The orders revealed that this convoy took 2 days to travel to its final destination at the Ukrainian border. Near that location, the book TILA and its crew were picked up in the early hours of 17 July 2014. The next day, they were handed over at that same location. There is a great deal of photo and video footage of this convoy of 23 June. The route described in the orders matches the route shown in this visual material, and the number plates listed in the orders also match the number plates on these images. These images also show 6 book TILAs complete with vehicle numbers. One of them is book TILA 3X2. The other identifiable book vehicles each have a vehicle number beginning with 2. The first digit of the vehicle number refers to the battalion. This means that book TILA 3X2 came from the 3rd Battalion, whereas the other book vehicles came from the 2nd Battalion. The orders contain no information about the objective of the deployment near the Ukrainian border. However, a document from 2017 from the commander of the 53rd Brigade refers to strategic exercises on unknown terrain in 2014. On 17 July 2014, the book TILA that shot down MH17 was captured on film multiple times. This visual material reflects what was discussed in intercepted telephone conversations. Images of the TILA help shed light on the involvement of Gherkin, Dubinsky and Karchenko. The last image of the book TILA was captured on the morning of 18 July in Luhansk. Since images of the TILA could also shed light on its crew, the investigation also looked into how the TILA was transported after being returned to Russia, whether by air, rail or road. No indications were found that would point to rail transport. The JIT does, however, have a satellite photo from 20 July taken in the vicinity of Milarovo, which shows a single vehicle covered on a low loader. You see that image on the left. The shape and dimensions of this covered vehicle are consistent with the covered vehicles that were observed on a satellite image of the 53rd Brigade's base shortly before the departure of the 1st Battalion. You see that image on the right. In addition, on 20 July, a photo was posted to social media of a covered book TLR on a truck. This truck was also part of the convoy in June that included TLR 3X2. It could not be determined if one of the images just shown includes TLR 3X2. The investigation into the TLR's possible removal by air determined that on the morning of 18 July, 2 Ilyushin IL-76s were on standby at the near military airfield in Rostov-on-Don. An IL-76 is capable of transporting a TLR. A day later, only one of these aircraft was observed there. It was not possible to determine what happened to the other one and whether it was used to dispose TLR 3X2. At various points on 18 July, starting at 6:08 in the morning, an IL-76 was observed at the Kursk military airfield, always seemingly at the same spot. In any case, the Ilyushin sitting at this airfield at 6:08 could not be the one from Rostov-on-Don that transported the book TLR 3X2 to Kursk. The 3X2 crossed the border around 6 a.m. and thus could not have been flown to Kursk by 6:08 a.m. It could not be determined for certain if the TLR 3X2 was transported by air. In summary, the investigation was unable to establish what happened to the TLR after it arrived in Russia. And that brings us to the crew. The orders concerning the first convoy, which included book TLR 3X2, contained no information about the accompanying crew. Documents from the second convoy show that as of 15 July, at least 193 military personnel belonging to the 53rd Brigade were deployed to the same border region. They must have arrived there before book TLR 3X2 crossed the border on 17 July, and for that reason, they were included in the investigation of the crew. These 193 individuals were mentioned by name. Most belonged to the 1st Battalion, while a smaller number were part of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions. These include members of the staff, such as Commander Muchkayev, and although it's plausible that Muchkayev knew about his brigade's deployment of the book TLR by virtue of his position, there are no concrete indications of this. Nor is there any telecom data. It is not possible to confirm Muchkayev's presence in the border region around the time of the downing of MH17. It was not possible to question him during the criminal proceedings because Russia would not allow it. All military personnel of the 53rd Brigade, for whom there were indications they may have been in the border region when the book TLR was deployed, were investigated further. Of that number, 35 officers were considered capable, on the basis of their rank and position, of operating a book TLR. 7 other soldiers were found to have worked as a book TLR operator or as the driver of a book vehicle. These findings do not, however, rule out the possibility that there were other officers with the same skills or operators or drivers in the border region. In the course of the investigation, a number of current and former members of the 53rd Brigade were tracked down and examined. Those individuals also provided information without knowing that it would end up in the hands of the investigation team. This was the only reason that several of them stated they had been in the Ukraine in the summer of 2014 during their time with the 53rd Brigade. Investigators were unable to confirm this information through direct questioning. One of them did say that he was very afraid and unwilling to take any more risks. He was unwilling or unable to say anything about the crew. There are also chat records involving former members of the 53rd Brigade, which point to the presence of a number of military personnel of the 3rd Battalion in the Russian-Ukrainian border region in July 2014. they reportedly left separately for a secret destination. These unnamed contract soldiers were under the command of an officer who was mentioned by rank and name. The investigation revealed the identity of this officer. At the time, he was a member of the personal staff of the brigade commander, Muchkayev. It could not be determined whether this officer was present in the border region on 17 July 2014. Notably, this officer appears in photos on social media after 17 July wearing two military decorations, one for the development of and combat operations with a book system, and another for extraordinary service with the Russian security service, FSB. Information provided by a witness points in another direction. This witness said to have heard from someone in the Russian army that 4 people attached to the 53rd Brigade were involved in the downing of the Boeing. These 4 comprised the crew of the book. The witness in question mentions 2 names. The examining magistrate investigated the witness and determined on the basis of his or her position that he or she would have been capable of obtaining this information. The 2 names given matched those of 2 officers of the 53rd Brigade. It has been established that at least one of them was deployed in the border region in the summer of 2014. Both were members of the 2nd Company of the 2nd Battalion. In an information report by the SBU, one of the officers named by the witness was mentioned as a crew member who had gone drinking with the separatist Tesmak after the downing of MH17. A witness confirmed this, but did not name the crew member in question. Tesmak was examined by the JIT on multiple occasions. He disputes having had any contact with the crew and denies any involvement in the downing of MH17. The investigation ultimately yielded insufficient indications pointing to Semak's criminal involvement. In summary, a total of 3 names of officers emerged who may have been involved in the downing of MH17. However, to date, the investigation has not been able to find any further confirmation of this. The Russian authorities have refused to answer any questions about the crew, as they maintain that there was never any Russian Bukhtila in eastern Ukraine. Finally, on 17 July and 25 September 2022, names and photographs circulated on Twitter concerning 4 members of the 2nd Battalion who were said to have shot down MH17. The investigation team obtained the information that formed the basis of those tweets, and this included a 2015 personnel list for the 53rd Brigade, which was already known to the JIT, and numerous pieces of passport information. On the basis of this information and the findings of its own investigation, the JIT concluded that there were no indications that these 4 individuals were involved in the downing of MH17. Thank you.
Good afternoon. We will now consider how the Bukhtila was supplied to the DPR. And the court has established that as of mid-May 2014, the Russian Federation and Ukraine were involved in an international armed conflict in eastern Ukraine because the Russian authorities had overall control over the fighting in the DPR. DPR leaders were in close contact with Russian Presidential Executive Office, Kremlin advisors, and the Russian intelligence service. Staff members of these government bodies also came up in the JIT's investigation into the decision-making process about the provision of the Bukhtila to the DPR. The main source for this is telecom data, involving both intercepted phone conversations from the case file and new conversations. And a number of these conversations are mentioned in the report, and we will play excerpts from them shortly. We will discuss the findings of the investigations in chronological order, starting with the arrival of the Russians, Girkin and Borodai, in the eastern of Ukraine in the spring of 2014, in the immediate wake of the establishment of the Donetsk People's Republic, the DPR. On the 12th of April, Girkin crossed into the Ukraine from Crimea and was appointed Minister of Defense. He was followed shortly by Borodai, who was given the role of the Prime Minister of the DPR. And both men had previously been involved in the annexation of Crimea, by their own account as advisors of the Russian Aksyonov, the so-called Prime Minister of the Crimea. While in Ukraine, Borodai and Girkin stayed in close contact with Aksyonov. And in June 2014, there was heavy fighting between the Ukrainian army and troops of the DPR and other separatists of the Luhansk People's Republic, the LPR. And during this fighting, both of the DPR and the LPR requested heavier weaponry, including better anti-aircraft systems. For example, Plotnitsky, the so-called defense minister of the LPR, speaks in Russia in June 2014 with the Military Intelligence Service, the GRU, and asks for heavier air defense weapons to be provided. And also, Girkin, the Minister of Defense of the DPR, makes the same request. When his headquarters in Slavyansk came under heavy fire in early June 2014, Girkin told Aksyonov that they needed decent anti-aircraft systems with trained personnel. The investigation carried out shows that from the second half of July 2014, several buktailers have been delivered to the separatists, including the buktailer that was used to shoot down flight MH17. The investigation was able to shed some light on the Russian decision-making process regarding the delivery of the heavier anti-aircraft weapon systems to the separatists. When Girkin requested for decent anti-aircraft systems with trained personnel, Aksyonov replied to Girkin that on Tuesday he was where he needed to be given the situation, that a joint coordination center had been set up, and that the necessary documents for the support were already being drawn up. He said that he still needed to wait because they were in different places and would be away for 2 days. It is known from another conversation that Aksyonov was in Sochi on Tuesday, the 3rd of June. And according to the Kremlin, Putin was there on that day as well. On the 5th and 6th of June, Putin was in France for the D-Day commemoration, together with various world leaders. And in a conversation of the 7th of June, Aksyonov assistant mentioned that the decision to provide support had been postponed by a week because there was only one person who could make that decision, not a general or the Minister of Defense, but the person who was directly accountable to the people and who was currently in a summit in France. We will now play a part of this conversation.
Там такая ситуация. Я сегодня получил пизделей, потому что сказал, что вы слишком медленно думаете. Говорю, там Казицын занял пост, один из 3 на границе, и надо людей вооружать, чтобы они удержали этот пост. Ну, именно граница все открыта. Я такого раздолбая получил. Ты не поверишь. Оказывается, понимаешь, давай я тезисно тебе скажу, чтобы ты понимал. Хорошо. Там получается вот та информация, которую я говорил с 3 людьми, помнишь, последняя, в МИДе? Да. Люди улетели в Москву, попросили неделю паузы, чтобы это первый принимает лично решение. Самый первый. Ага, я понял. Они меня сегодня отъебали, сказали, что тут никакой генерал, никакой министр, никакой министр обороны. Это все как сказать, как они сказали, подожди, лично отвечает перед народом, вот первый, понимаешь, он принимает решение. А так как там сейчас этот саммит во Франции, он должен дать добро на вот все это. Ты представляешь, какой уровень?
The defense minister would appear to refer to Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, the Russian minister of defense. And the next day, Aksyonov's aide took part in a similar conversation, in which he said that his bosses needed another week because there was only one person who could make that decision and who was responsible, and he was in France. We will now play a part of that conversation.
Понимаете, там еще такая проблема, что наши эти боссы, они абсолютно не верят в никакой связи вообще. Они только вот на самолет уехал, доложил обратно. То есть это все время занимает.
Ну да.
Они мне сказали, что принято решение положительное. Но вот попросили еще неделю, потому что там первое в этом, Франции. Только он принимает решение, больше никто.
Понятно. Ну да.
Я там заикнулся, давайте быстрее, потому что там реально такой шанс нельзя терять, потому что граница пока под контролем, надо там помогать. Они меня тут как выебали, тут нарали на меня. Ты не понимаешь, что ты что не понимаешь, что ты ее только первое указание, пока до него дойдет это время, кто-то такой там, короче. Я так понял, там ответственность только на одном человеке, только на первом, понимаешь? Все. Как он говорит, так и делается.
In the second half of June 2014, Aksionov and the deputy head of the GRU, Alexei Jumin, requested a political decision on providing the People's Army in Donbass with heavier anti-aircraft systems, such as an S-200 or a Buk system. And this happened at a meeting at the Presidential Executive Office in Moscow. This office is a state body that assists the president, and it played an active role in the conflict in eastern Ukraine in 2014. The request by Aksionov and Jumin was supported by Vladislav Surkov, an advisor to Putin, and Konstantin Malofev, an oligarch who was involved in the annexation of Crimea. A contributing factor in this regard is that separatists had previously shot down a large military transport aircraft. And following that incident, the Ukraine armed forces had started flying at higher altitudes. And this is why the separatists needed air defenses with a greater range. At this meeting at the Presidential Executive Office, a written resolution was adopted to submit the request for heavier anti-aircraft systems to Shoigu and President Putin. This request was granted. However, it's not known if the Buk system was specifically mentioned in this request. The investigation showed that the aforementioned meeting at the Presidential Executive Office, in which the participants discussed providing heavier anti-aircraft systems to the DPR, must have taken place between the 14th and the 30th of June 2014. In that period, from the 14th to the 19th of June, Borodai was in Moscow, as well as the separatist Fominov. And during that time in Moscow, both Borodai and Fominov spoke in intercepted conversations about the meetings and discussions, including a big meeting on the 19th of June, which revolved around the support, believed to be of a military nature, and which was ultimately granted. In a closed meeting with the members of the Duma on the 19th of June, Shoigu reported that the armed forces were ready to carry out any task given by the leadership of the country and the commander-in-chief, in other words, by Putin. According to the Kremlin, that evening, the Russian Security Council held a meeting on the situation on the southeastern Ukraine. It is not known if the subject of the heavier anti-aircraft system, such as the Buk, was discussed. In any event, a short time later, heavier military material, including tanks, was delivered. And also, on the 23rd of June, a large military convoy departed for the Ukrainian border, including the Buk Taylor, which was used to shoot down MH17 on the 17th of July. To this day, it has not been established whether the decision to supply the DPR with the Buk was made before or after the departure of this convoy. And at that time, Surkov, the key advisor of Putin, worked at the Presidential Executive Office, where the meeting about the air support was held. He is believed to have been put in charge in Donbass affairs in July 2014. And according to Girkin, Surkov had the tactical command, and he managed the situation in Ukraine in his capacity as advisor to Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. In an interview, Borodai said that Surkov was the most senior Russian official involved in the matter, and that Surkov, as aide to the president, reported directly and on a regular basis to Putin. Borodai's phone data revealed that he was in close contact with Surkov nearly every day, and sometimes multiple times a day, except when he, Borodai, was in Moscow. In intercepted phone conversations, Surkov coordinated a variety of issues with Borodai, such as the encirclement of Slavyansk, the establishment of an additional security service, payments, and the intransigent attitude of a DPR commander. And in addition, when Borodai sought to coordinate with Moscow about delivery of the refrigerated rail containers containing the bodies of the victims and the black boxes from MH17, his first point of contact was Surkov. This brings us to the position of President Putin. Intercepted conversations revealed that the decision about whether to provide military support lay with Putin. There is also specific information showing that the request to supply the separatists with heavier anti-aircraft systems was submitted to Putin and that the request was granted. Other sources as well point out to the president's personal involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine, mainly behind the scenes. For example, although on the 24th of June 2014, Putin publicly asked the Russian Federation Council to rescind the resolution that gave him the authority to conduct military interventions in the Ukraine, it remained abundantly clear to the DPR that the Russian president was still involved in the conflict. There are also indications that Putin wished to be briefed in detail about the course of the conflict. For example, the downing of a Ukrainian helicopter. The Ukrainian politician, Medvedchuk, also passed on messages from the president with instructions that the DPR must respect a ceasefire. Medvedchuk also spoke with Borodai about an upcoming prisoner swap, in his own words, at the request of the president. And later, Medvedchuk was mentioned by Putin himself in a conversation with Plotnitsky, at that time the so-called Prime Minister of the LPR. On the 15th of November 2017, Putin was personally briefed by Plotnitsky about the military component and asked him about Medvedchuk's initiative for a prisoner exchange. We will now play the entire conversation.
Да.
Игорь Венедиктович.
Да.
Здравствуйте. Это вас беспокоит Москва, спецкоммутатор. Вас просит Владимир Владимирович.
Спасибо, давайте.
Я правильно попала? Это телефон Плотницкого.
Да.
Хорошо,
Да.
одну секундочку, я вас соединяю. Секунду.
Да, хорошо.
Алло.
Алло.
Игорь Венедиктович, добрый день. Это Мамакин Тион, секретарь. Сейчас одну секунду буду соединять.
Да, пожалуйста, хорошо.
Алло.
Да, добрый вечер.
Игорь Венедиктович, добрый день.
Да.
Добрый день, говорю, здравствуйте.
Да, здравствуйте, господин президент.
Как дела у вас?
Да, спасибо, Владимир Владимирович. Потихоньку.
Потихонечку. Как вы оцениваете вот такую военную составляющую?
Военная составляющая, мне кажется, у нас на достаточно хорошей высоте. Здесь сказать, что мы какие-то слабые.
Обострения никакого нет, не чувствуете?
Обострение периодически есть, но это именно периодически вызванное то сменой дислокации различных воинских частей, то пересменка. Но таких особо жестоких пока, слава богу, не было.
А социально-экономическая ситуация?
Социально-экономическая ситуация, мы как бы ее достаточно нормально сдерживаем, нивелируем различными способами, но уровень жизни, конечно же, желает быть лучшим. И у нас как бы есть и вопросы, и предложения, как его повысить, но не всегда нам удается решить эти вопросы.
Я уже и Александру Владимировичу сказал, может быть, мы тогда, я попрошу коллег, которые там стараются вам помочь по различным направлениям, чтобы они мне дополнительно доложили, что там происходит, а может потом увидимся, поговорим, хорошо?
Спасибо, Владимир Ильич, но если есть такая возможность, может быть, это организация личной встречи для обсуждения этих ряда вопросов.
Я про это и сказал, я говорю, потом увидимся и поговорим с вами.
Спасибо большое, Владимир Ильич.
Да, Игорь Викторович, я по поводу, вы, наверное, слышали там инициативы Медведчука?
Да, конечно.
До обмена?
Да, конечно, Владимир Ильич.
Как вы к этому относитесь?
Ну, очень даже положительно, потому что в течение года Украина блокировала и не давала возможности нормального обмена. Наши жители, а их подавляющее большинство, у них нас там 1 к 10 примерно, они, конечно же, страдают там в застенках, и страдают. Это не просто оборот речи, они реально, мы знаем, как они там содержатся, в отличие от того, как их люди находятся на нашей территории. Поэтому эта инициатива для нас, честно говоря, как глоток свежего воздуха. Это возможность забрать наших людей с той территории.
Игорь Ильич, тогда я так понимаю, что нужно там дополнительные детали проработать. Я своих коллег тоже попрошу, чтобы они вас поддержали, помогли, где нужно и что нужно.
Спасибо, есть. Спасибо.
Спасибо вам большое. Всего доброго.
Спасибо, до свидания.
До связи, до свидания. Так, удачи.
Спасибо большое.
This conversation from 2017 is in keeping with the findings of late June 2014, which showed that Putin was personally involved in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. It is also in keeping with a witness statement that the same individual, Plotnitsky, carried an encrypted phone containing direct numbers for President Putin. And as the JIT repeatedly discovered, not everyone was equally disciplined when it came to security of communications. That concludes the matter of supplying the bucktailor. The JIT previously also conducted an investigation to the parties responsible for the deployment of the bucktailor on the 17th of July 2014. Girgin, Dubinsky, and Kharchenko have already been convicted, but the investigation has looked at other individuals as well. One of them is the aforementioned Borodai. In the beginning of the 6th of July 2014, over a week after the arrival of bucktailor 3X2 at the border, changes were made to the military and political structure of the DPR. Russian generals were sent to the eastern Ukraine for the purpose of forming a joint staff for coordinating the military operations of the DPR and LPR. It remains unclear how much actual influence they exerted in July 2014. And according to Girkin, he did not receive any instructions from this staff. In the run-up to the offensive south of Schnitze, Girkin regularly conferred with Moscow. And during this period, as well as in June and August, Borodai was in almost daily contact with someone he described to others as the commander of this operation and the one that makes all the decisions. This person has been identified by the investigation team as Andrei Burlaka, an FSB general who was first deputy head of the FSB border service. And the investigation showed that in various cases, Burlaka gave orders to Borodai and was directly involved from the Russian Federation in internal DPR affairs. Burlaka also gave direct instructions to subordinates of Girkin, which Girkin, for his part, accepted. And Burlaka also appeared to have information about the military deployment in eastern Ukraine. For example, on the 16th of July, Borodai called Burlaka and asked him if it was possible that our helicopters were carrying out an attack at the vicinity of Marinka. At that point, Borlaka asked Boratai to turn on the phone's encryption mode, as he would always do when the latter called him. We will now play that conversation.
Да. Владимир Иванович, да, скажите, а у нас вертолеты могут работать? Доброе утро, извините.
Доброе утро.
Да, у нас вертолеты могут работать в районе Маринки, наши.
Ключик включите.
From the 14th of July, there was heavy fighting south of Shizde between the Ukrainian troops and the DPR. And the court has already established that the bug teller was deployed in the context of this fighting. The planning and execution of this DPR offensive were in the hands of Girgin, Dubinsky, Polotov, and Khachenko, among others. Borodai was also present and was briefed on the DPR's military progress during the fighting. However, there are no indications that Borodai was personally overseeing combat operations. And when the offensive stalled and the DPI fighters came on a heavy fighter, a request was made for a bug system, and that request was granted. And when the bug trailer was brought into Donetsk on the morning of the 17th of July, Dubinsky made arrangements for its deployment. And at that moment, Borodai and Gherkin were also at DPR headquarters. The investigation team was unable to determine whether Borodai was aware that at that time the availability of this bug trailer was present. Borodai did, however, speak to Borlaka on the phone for more than 20 times on the 17th of July. Because his calls took place on an encrypted phone, the substance of the conversations is unknown. No conversations involving Borodai or Borlaka about the downing of MH17 or the request for, delivery or removal of the bug trailer were intercepted. Nor is there any evidence that Borodai was in the vicinity of Gherkin and Dubinsky when they were dealing with the removal of the book.
Now we will talk about the opportunities for the investigation and prosecution. The JITS investigation has reached its limit. As things now stand, this leads to the following conclusions. All relevant and available telecom data has now been analyzed. The JIT has investigated everything it can without the cooperation of the Russian authorities and without jeopardizing people's safety. Any further evidence must be sought in the Russian Federation. And for this, the JIT is dependent on the cooperation of the Russian authorities or Russian insider witnesses. Such witnesses cannot speak freely and would expose themselves to major security risks if they were to talk to the JIT. To this day, the Russian authorities continue to deny, contrary to the established facts, any involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine on and around 17 July 2014. On multiple occasions, the Russian Federation has provided the JIT with falsified evidence, exonerating itself. At other times, the authorities simply refuse to provide any information. The Russian authorities have also publicly cast doubt on the court's judgment. Relations with the Russian Federation have deteriorated further since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on 24 February 2022. The investigation's findings to date do not provide sufficient grounds for prosecution. There are either formal obstacles to a prosecution or the necessary lawful and convincing evidence is lacking. We will explain that shortly. First, let's consider the crew of the book trailer and their superiors. These military superiors include the commander of the 53rd Brigade, the Minister of Defense, and, as a commander-in-chief, the Russian president. Second-hand information was obtained about the possible involvement of 3 current or former officers of the 53rd Brigade. This information is ambiguous, and thus far it cannot be confirmed to an adequate extent. Since it had not yet been possible to establish the identity of the Buktaler crew members, it is not possible to establish why they fired a Buk missile at MH17. Nor do we know who gave them their orders and what those orders entailed. It remains unclear who knew what in the Russian military chain of command about the downing of flight MH17 and what degree of say they actually had regarding it. Prosecution of the crew and their superiors in the military chain of command is therefore impossible because the evidence that has been gathered is not strong enough to be lawful and convincing. Furthermore, as members of the regular armed forces of the Russian Federation, the crew members and their superior officers may be able to claim combatant immunity. This is a rule of international law that stipulates that countries may not prosecute each other's military personnel. The immunity continues to apply even after the individual concerned has left the armed forces. Combatants can be prosecuted for war crimes. However, without concrete information about the circumstances in which the decision was made to fire the Buk missile at MH17, it cannot be determined whether the downing of MH17 was a war crime. And now let us turn to those responsible for supplying the Buktaler. As the district court held, in the circumstances in question, it may be assumed that anyone who helped facilitate the deployment of this weapon had both intent and premeditation in respect of unlawfully causing the crash of flight MH17 and the death of everybody on board. There are strong indications that a decision was made at presidential level by President Putin to supply the DPR with the Buktaler or, in any event, a heavier air defense system. Although we speak of strong indications, the high bar of complete and conclusive evidence is not reached. Furthermore, in addition to the possibility of combatant immunity, the President of the Russian Federation also enjoys, at the very least, immunity under international law in view of his position as head of state. Under Dutch law, heads of state cannot be prosecuted for any offense whatsoever, even war crimes. This immunity applies for as long as Putin is head of state. The investigation into the decision-making about the provision of the missile produced other names besides Putin, including Aksionov, Surkov, Dyumin, and Shoigu. In the case of Aksionov, Surkov, and Dyumin, there are indications that they supported the request for a heavier air defense system and arranged for it to be submitted to Shoigu and Putin. The question is whether, in doing so, they also had a criminal responsibility for the deployment of this weapon. In any event, they had no actual decision-making power about whether to provide a Buktaler. That authority lay at a higher level. In order to determine whether they were sufficiently helpful in facilitating the deployment of the Buktaler, that their actions constituted criminal aiding and abetting, further and more concrete evidence is needed. There is, therefore, insufficient evidence as yet to hold them criminally liable for the downing of MH17. In the case of Shoigu, there is a lack of clarity about whether, as Minister of Defense, he had decision-making power when it came to supplying the Buktaler. The investigation mainly found indications that this was ultimately the President's decision and not Shoigu's. This means that there is no concrete evidence for his criminal involvement in providing the weapon that shot down MH17. Apart from the evidential problem with both Dyumin as deputy head of the GRU and Shoigu as Minister of Defense may be able to claim combatant immunity. Then there is Borodai. He held various consultations with Russian officials in Moscow about the provision of military equipment. Since it could not be clearly determined whether those consultations concerned the provision of a book system he cannot be held responsible for its delivery. This brings us to the parties involved in the actual deployment of the booktailer. The investigation did not uncover any concrete instructions given by Russian generals or other Russian officials regarding the deployment of the booktailer. There were, however, indications of a direct, de facto chain of command between FSB General Bulaka and DPR leaders Borodai and Girkin. It is not clear whether Bulaka was involved in a criminal capacity in the deployment of the booktailer. Since he used a secure line, the contents of his phone conversations are not known. Conversations held by other parties about Bulaka show that his orders to Borodai and to Girkin's subordinates related to internal conflicts and dynamics among DPR commanders, as well as the provision of equipment. However, nothing was said about providing a heavier air defense system. Borodai's role primarily seemed to involve administration, logistics, and military support. He made arrangements for support from Russia, but when it came to operational military commands, he would refer people to Girkin. Although he was present at Girkin's headquarters that morning, and although he was in regular contact with Bulaka by phone on 17 July 2014, the investigation was unable to establish that Borodai and Bulaka had advanced knowledge of the availability of the booktailer. Nor could any involvement on his part in the removal of the weapon be established following the downing of MH17. Therefore, in contrast to the conclusion of the district court in Girkin's case, it is not possible at this time to provide lawful and convincing evidence that Borodai and Bulaka were able to decide on the deployment and use of the booktailer, and that they accepted that deployment and use. Nor is it possible to prove that they deliberately aided and abetted the downing of MH17 in another way. This brings us to the conclusion of this presentation. After more than 8.5 years, the JIT has exhausted all scope for investigation. The investigation will therefore now be suspended. Despite the complex context, the JIT achieved a great deal. The findings of the investigation do not provide sufficient grounds for the prosecution of new individuals. This does not mean, however, that the JIT is closing the case. The phone lines for witnesses and the MH17 website will remain active, so that any insider witness who might wish to tell their story in the future will be able to do so. With this in mind, the JIT agreement will also be renewed. New information or a change in circumstances may give reason to resume the investigation or institute new criminal proceedings. The bar for establishing individual criminal liability is high. At present, we cannot reach that bar for the various individuals discussed. But the picture that the investigation has given us of Russian involvement could play a key role in the state responsibility proceedings. We know that the answers to our questions can be found in Russia. And as we have said many times before, solving these kinds of crimes take patience and endurance. Just consider the Lockerbie case, in which a suspect was recently arrested after 34 years. In that spirit, the JIT remains dedicated to the MH17 investigation. Thank you for your attention.
So we have now room for a couple of questions. We have interpreters here, so if there are questions in Dutch, they can also be asked. And there are questions for all the members on stage. So are there any questions? Steven Derks, please put on your microphone until it turns.
Steven Derks, Dutch newspaper, NSA. A question for Mrs. van Boetselaar. How long has Mr. Putin been a suspect in this investigation?
Yeah, we have talked, we've done this investigation for 8.5 years, and we talked about many, somebody pushed a button. Please don't push the button because then it goes away by mine. Ja. Oh ja, ik kan dit in het Nederlands beantwoorden. We hebben 8,5 jaar onderzoek gedaan. We hebben vandaag heel veel personen besproken. En van al deze personen uiteindelijk zijn we tot de conclusie gekomen dat we, onvoldoende bewijs hebben om tot een vervolging te komen. En we kunnen niet, ik word een beetje afgeleid, want iedereen doet de woordjes op. There are no, ja, daarom, precies. No. Nee, er is geen vertaling. Okay, I'll do this in English. That's better because there are translators, but it's not directly translated. We did investigation for 8.5 years. All the individuals we spoke about today, we said there is not enough evidence or there is an immunity, and that's why we cannot prosecute. That's what the important thing is about this conclusion.
But that was not my question. So Mr. Putin was a suspect in this investigation. That's what you're saying.
The idea of suspect is a very Dutch thing in criminal law. What is because you look at the circumstances, you look at what is their role, what can be said about their role, and what we say about the role is that we do have strong indications about his decision making, but we do not reach the high bar. And beside that, because at this moment Putin is still head of state, he is head of state, he has an immunity. So only after he is not a head of state, we can look into what's next, step by step.
Mike Corder from AP. So can you just clarify, if Putin is no longer president, will you seek his prosecution? Is it a lack of evidence that has prevented you launching criminal proceedings against him, or is it the immunity issue?
In the system of the law, you first look at the immunity. There is immunity, and that's why he cannot be prosecuted. This is an immunity other than the combated immunity, which is linked to his position as head of state. But especially for the next of kin and for everybody, it's important to know, this question is a logical question, but not a legal logical thing. But that's why we said more than we have strong indications, but we do not reach that high bar of the evidence that it's a closed case. So.
Stephanie Vandenberg from Reuters. He has immunity under Dutch law. He does not have immunity under the ICC, which is also looking at the situation in Ukraine from 2013 onwards, if I recall correctly. Will you be handing over your findings also to the ICC so that they might do something with this case, or Mr. Putin?
Yeah. Especially for that reason, but not only especially for that reason, but for everybody, because we have the obligation to inform the next of kin, but also the public at large. It's not only this meeting, but we also made a report which is put online since 1 o'clock. It's 70 pages. It has lots of information in it. You just had a compact part of it now, and it's available for everybody. And I think there will be people interested in it.
Hi, Danny Kemp from AFP. Can I just ask you, are you disappointed personally that you can't prosecute Vladimir Putin over this? Thank you.
I think all of us who are involved in this case, have started this 8.5 years ago, not thinking we would come as far as we had come now. And all the time, the reason why we did this is finding out the truth for especially the next of kin. What happened? Why did it happen? Who can be held responsible? And I think that we came further, and I think I can speak for all of us, we came further than we had ever thought when we started this. And I think also in our business, you know those, there are immunities. And I think also what the strength of this investigation and the work of the JIT is that it's step by step and that we keep on, we hold on. It's just, we go on, and if the world changes, and we have possibilities again. Yeah.
Maybe just an add-on from the police perspective. Are we disappointed? No, because we think we came further than we have ever thought in 2014. Would we have liked to come further? Of course, yes. That is, every detective would have liked to come further. But at this point, we've reached our limits. We've done everything that we can within our limits, and the next answers, they lay in Russia. And as long as there's no cooperation in Russia, those answers will remain there. For us, the direct answer on your question, we're not disappointed. Actually, I'm really proud on the team that has established this. We have 3 suspects. We have life sentences. We have a great context of what has been done on the supply and on the also the movement of the bug. However, yes. Thank you.
Can I just add, from an Australian point of view, the disappointment that you're asking after would settle on us, I think, if we felt we hadn't done all we could do, and we would be disappointed in ourselves. We're disappointed for people, the families in particular, disappointed for their ongoing grief, but the disappointment would be far more pronounced on our part if we felt we hadn't done all that we could reasonably do in the circumstances, and I believe we have.
Molly Quell, Courthouse News Service. You mentioned at the very end here that the case pending before the European Court of Human Rights. Do you and perhaps your Ukrainian counterparts feel that the evidence produced in this investigation will go further in sort of proving Russian state accountability at the court in Strasbourg? And has this information, or will it be communicated to them as part of the ongoing proceedings there?
We just recently had, the 25th of January, had a ruling of the European Court that they said they would look into the case. And in their decision, they referred a lot to the work the JIT did. They mentioned it as excellent work. They said that the JIT managed to pierce the fog of war. And you can see so that they really look into what we did. And I reckon, and of course, that's why we also have this report. It will be available to the court, and they will, I suppose they will look into it. And it's, it's not my job, but I think it's one of the reasons, no, it's not one of the reasons, but it's good that the work we did can be used in those other proceedings.
Jacqueline Magnay from the Australian newspaper. Understandably, you've been focused very much on the chain of command and the pressing of the Buk missile, but have you also been looking at the process that allowed an aircraft to be flying over a war zone at that time, and who was responsible for allowing that to happen?
Now, and that's maybe also the answer to Molly's questions partly, is what our job is as the prosecutor's office and as the police, that we look into the downing of MH17 from a criminal perspective, and which individuals, not states, but individuals can be held accountable. And it's always in cases that are also other perspectives, and there are other organizations who look into what can we learn from this, what other things can be done. And so this is about flying over another area. It's not in the criminal investigation. It's not what we looked at. We have the criminal focus on what happened with the downing of MH17 by the MOOC missile. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, you have spoken to the families and given this report. What was their reaction?
Of course, there was disappointment, because they really would. I can really understand that they wanted to know why MH17 was shut down. Because we're really clear on what has happened, but the answer to the question why MH17 is shut down still remains in Russia. On the other hand, the next of kin were also really grateful for the work that has been done. So this morning has been quite emotional as well for the next of kin, as for the law enforcement and prosecutors have been working on it. But yes, it was a dual feeling of disappointment, but also respect. Thank you.
I think we came to an end of the press conference. Oh, yeah, we have many more questions, but I would just suggest, because we have to leave here at 3 o'clock, and we have many requests for one-on-one interviews, that we're going to do that now and end this session. Okay? So all the persons on stage are available for one-on-one interviews. We can do that here or outside. Thank you very much.
Very